I knew the moment had arrived when his father's face went still. Not angry, not embarrassed, just still, the way a person goes when the ground beneath them has quietly shifted, and they're trying to figure out if they felt it correctly. He was holding his phone under the dinner table, the glow of the screen reflected in his glasses. He read the page once, then he read it again, and then he looked up at me with an expression I had seen before, not on him, but on others. On senior partners who underestimated me in boardrooms, on opposing counsel who confused quiet with soft, on the faces of people who had just realized they had misread the room entirely. That moment came after the drive up the 400, after the casserole and the small talk, after the comment about whether I planned to keep working once Daniel and I had children. But before any of that, I was just a woman standing on a porch in Sudbury holding a bottle of Niagara Peninsula Riesling, telling myself this would be a perfectly ordinary evening. Daniel had proposed 3 months earlier. We were at a small Italian restaurant on College Street, the kind of place with no reservations and candles stuck into wine bottles. He got down on one knee between the breadbasket and the house salad, and the table beside us started clapping before I even answered. I said yes. Of course I said yes. He was good and steady and kind in all the quiet ways that matter more than people admit out loud. He had been that way since the night we met, at a friend's rooftop gathering in Leslieville, 2 summers before. He was talking to someone about hiking the Bruce Trail, completely unpretentious, a beer in one hand and a paper plate of samosas in the other. We talked for 3 hours and he never once asked me where I worked. That was the part I had grown to love about him, probably more than anything else. I had been vague about my career from the beginning, not deceptive. I told him I was a lawyer. That was true. I told him I worked downtown. Also true. I mentioned long hours, difficult clients, the particular exhaustion that comes from spending your days inside high-stakes arguments. All of that was accurate. What I never mentioned was that I was the youngest named partner in the history of Aldridge, Croft & Park, one of the 10 most prominent corporate litigation firms in the country. I didn't mention that my name was on the door of a firm with offices in Toronto, Calgary, and Vancouver. I didn't bring up the Supreme Court of Canada file that had consumed 18 months of my life, or the profile that had run in the Globe and Mail when the decision came down. I certainly didn't mention that I managed a team of 42 lawyers, and that the retainers we held ran into the hundreds of millions. This wasn't strategic. It was protective. I had spent enough of my career watching rooms change the moment people learned what I did and what I billed. Conversations that had been easy became careful. Questions became calculations. Friendships that felt genuine revealed themselves to be something else angled, slightly, toward usefulness. With Daniel, I had stumbled into something rare, someone who knew me before he knew what I was worth. By the time I could have corrected the omission, it had been a year, and then 2. And then he was kneeling beside a breadbasket asking me to marry him. His parents had invited us for Thanksgiving weekend. It was their tradition, he explained. His father liked cooking the turkey himself, which apparently was a point of personal pride. They still lived in the house where Daniel had grown up, a brick semi on a quiet street about 15 minutes from the Kingsway Entertainment District. I had done the drive to Sudbury before, the long stretch of the Trans-Canada through the Canadian Shield, the rock cuts and the boreal trees, the radio slowly losing Toronto stations. There was something I always liked about that drive, the way the city released you gradually, then all at once. His mother met us at the door. She was warm in the way that people from smaller cities often are genuinely warm, not performatively so. A quick hug, a comment about the weather, an immediate offer of tea or coffee. His father appeared behind her, broad-shouldered, a retired steelworker with the handshake to prove it. He looked at me with a direct, assessing kind of friendliness that I understood. He was deciding whether I was real. "So, you're the lawyer," he said. "That's right," I said. He nodded once, as if he had filed that information in the correct folder. The folder, I suspected, was not labeled important. The house was warm and it smelled like roasting meat and fresh bread. There were family photographs in the hallway, Daniel at various ages, a school portrait, a hockey team photo, a fishing trip somewhere up north. His mother had set the dining room table for 6. His aunt and uncle were coming, she mentioned, and his cousin, who had just started his own plumbing business in Chelmsford. Big news in the family, she added, with real pride. He was only 26 and already had 2 employees. I smiled and said that was impressive, because it was. We settled into the living room. His father poured rye and ginger for the men and offered me wine without asking which kind. I took the wine. His mother asked if I wanted to help her finish setting the table, and I said of course. In the kitchen, she handed me a stack of cloth napkins and directed me toward the drawer where the napkin rings were kept. I folded and placed. She stirred things on the stove and asked whether Daniel and I were thinking about the West End or the East End when we found a house. We haven't really decided yet, I said. It's all so expensive now, she said, shaking her head. I don't know how young people manage. Daniel makes good money though. Steady job. Benefits. That matters more than people think. She paused and then added, carefully, will you keep working after? After what? I asked. After the wedding. After, you know. She nodded with a kind of gentle significance. Once things settled down, I told her I enjoyed my work and planned to continue. She received this the way some people receive weather forecasts. They find inconvenient politely, but without fully believing it. His uncle and aunt arrived just before the turkey was ready, followed by the cousin, who was 26 and confident in the way of someone who had recently figured something out about himself. He talked about his business at length through the first part of dinner. Contracts, scheduling, the cost of copper pipe, the problem with finding reliable tradespeople. His father and uncle asked follow-up questions with genuine interest. His mother said again how proud they all were. When the conversation shifted, it shifted to Daniel, his project, his new team lead role, a promotion he was apparently up for. Everyone at the table seemed to know about this. There were encouraging comments, questions, predictions. Daniel accepted them with the mild embarrassment of someone who loves his family but doesn't like being the subject of too much attention. Then there was a small pause, the kind that happens at dinner tables when one thread of conversation finishes and before the next one starts. His uncle looked at me across the table. "What kind of law do you do?" he asked. "Corporate litigation," I said. He nodded slowly, the same way his brother had at the door. "So, a lot of contracts? Paperwork? More court time than you'd think," I said. He seemed slightly surprised by this. "Big cases?" "Some," I said. He accepted that and moved on. The conversation drifted to the Leafs, as conversations in Ontario always eventually do. I ate my turkey and listened. Nobody asked me a follow-up question for the next 20 minutes. At one point, his mother got up to bring the cranberry sauce from the kitchen, looked at me and said, "Would you mind grabbing the gravy boat, dear? It's on the counter by the stove." I got up and got it, came back and put it on the table, sat down. His father was telling his son and nephew about a problem with the gutters he'd been dealing with for 2 seasons. The cousin offered to come take a look. His mother thanked him and said what would they do without him. I thought about the file I had argued before the Supreme Court. I thought about the 42 lawyers who sent me their drafts for review. I thought about the junior associate who had called me crying at 11 on a Tuesday night because opposing counsel had filed a motion she hadn't anticipated, and how I had talked her through it calmly for 40 minutes and then worked until 3 in the morning building the response. I ate my stuffing and smiled when it seemed appropriate. Near the end of the main course, his father leaned back in his chair and looked at me with a kind of practical directness I actually respected. "What is it you actually do, day to day? Like concretely?" I set down my fork. I advise major corporations on litigation strategy. When a company gets sued, or needs to sue, or is facing regulatory action, they come to us. I run the file. I argue in court when it gets there. "Big companies?" his uncle asked. "Yes," I said. "What kind of money are we talking? Like, for the company's legal fees?" I considered the answer for a moment. For a significant file, a client might spend $2 to $4 million in legal fees over the course of a matter. The cousin made a quiet sound. His father frowned slightly. "That's a lot." "It is," I agreed. "And your firm handles that." "My firm handles that," I said. "I handle that generally." His father's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, something recalibrating. "Who are the partners there? Would I know the name?" I said the name of the firm. He didn't recognize it, but he picked up his phone. I watched him type. He searched the firm name first, then looked at the results for a moment, then typed something else. My name, I was fairly certain. The page that came up on any search of my name was the firm's website, with my photo and my title, Claire Morrison, partner. Beneath that, a brief biography that mentioned the Supreme Court file, the industry award I'd received 2 years prior, the Bar Association committee I chaired. He read for longer than any of the other searches take. Then he put his phone face down on the table. He looked at me with the expression I recognized. The recalibration expression. The quiet, ground-shifting kind. "You're a partner," he said. "Not a question." "Yes," I said. "At that firm?" "Yes." He looked at Daniel. Daniel was watching me with wide eyes, and I realized in that moment that he hadn't known either. Not fully. He knew I was a lawyer. He didn't know I was that kind of lawyer. No one spoke for a few seconds. The refrigerator hummed. Somewhere in the neighborhood, a dog was barking at something. "Well," his father said finally. He didn't finish the sentence. His mother looked at her husband, then at me, then at Herr Hans. The atmosphere didn't explode. It didn't become a confrontation. It did something quieter and, I think, stranger. It rearranged itself. Within 5 minutes, his father had moved the gravy boat closer to my side of the table and asked whether I preferred it. His uncle refilled my wine without being asked. His mother brought out the good dessert plates. I noticed they were different from the ones we'd been using and placed mine first. The cousin, who had spent 20 minutes explaining the economics of plumbing, asked me, a bit stiffly, whether I had any thoughts on the legal requirements around hiring employees. Daniel barely touched his pie. Later, washing up in the kitchen, his mother stood beside me at the sink. "I didn't realize," she said quietly, "how important your work was." I kept my hands in the warm water. "It's work," I said, "same as anyone's." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "Why didn't you say so? At the beginning of dinner?" I thought about how to answer that. "Because I wanted to enjoy dinner," I said finally, and smiled in a way that ended the conversation without closing it harshly. On the drive back to the motel, we'd booked rooms because the drive home was too long to make at night. Daniel didn't speak for the first 20 minutes. The highway outside Sudbury is dark and wide, and the headlights picked up rock and tree and the occasional reflective road marker. Nothing else. "You're a named partner," he said eventually. "Yes." "You argued at the Supreme Court." "On one file." "Yes." He exhaled. "And you just didn't mention it. You never asked what kind of lawyer I was." "That's not." He stopped. "Tried again. I knew you were successful. I didn't know you were that." I turned to look at him. "What's that?" He didn't answer right away. I could see him struggling with something. Not anger. Something more uncomfortable than anger. "I feel like I've been walking around not knowing something that everyone who works with you knows. Like I had a version of you that was missing a whole dimension." "The dimension was always there," I said. "You just didn't ask about it." "But you could have told me." "I could have," I agreed. "And I should have. At some point. I'm not saying the timing was perfect, but I was trying to protect something, Daniel. When people know what I do, they stop treating me like a person. They start treating me like a resource." He was quiet again. "Did you think I was less of a partner for you tonight?" he asked. "Because of how you saw my parents treat you?" I looked out the window at the dark rock faces on the side of the highway. I thought they treated me the way people treat someone they're not very interested in knowing. That was the honest answer. And then the moment they found out who I was, they became very interested. Very carefully interested. And those two things sitting next to each other, that's the part that stays with me. He didn't say anything else. But he reached across the center console and held my hand for the rest of the drive. The next morning his father texted him to pass along an apology to me. It was a brief message. It said he hadn't meant to make me feel unwelcome, and that he hoped I knew that. Daniel read it to me over coffee at the Tim Hortons near the motel. I told him to tell his father I appreciated it. We drove back to Toronto mostly in silence, but a comfortable one. The kind where two people are thinking, and they know the other person is also thinking, and they're not afraid of what the other one might be thinking. I'd learned over 2 years that Daniel was genuinely good at that kind of silence. It was one of the things I loved about him. Back in the city, things shifted in ways I hadn't fully anticipated. His mother started texting me directly. Small things at first, a recipe she thought I might like, a question about a neighborhood restaurant. His father called Daniel twice in the following week, both times asking questions that were, on the surface, about the firm and corporate law, but were really, I suspected, about trying to find a way to be relevant to me. He sent me a link to an article about the Supreme Court. He called it fascinating. I thought about the turkey dinner. I thought about the gravy boat. The cousin sent me a DM on Instagram asking, very politely, if I could recommend someone for a small business incorporation. I gave him 2 names, and said either would serve him well. It wasn't unkindness. That was the thing I kept returning to. None of it had been unkind. It had been something more ordinary and, in some ways, harder to name. Assumption. The quiet, default assumption that a person at a table is exactly as significant as they appear to be, and that appearance is built from the visible things, the job title someone leads with, the neighborhood they mention, the car in the driveway. I had arrived in a sensible Subaru Outback with a modest bottle of Niagara wine, and I had been placed, wordlessly and without anyone deciding to do it, into the category of politely tolerated future daughter-in-law. Not unwanted. Just not particularly interesting. And now, because of some text on a website, I was interesting. The shift in behavior wasn't warm exactly. It was something closer to careful. Careful in the way of people who have decided they've made an error and are trying to correct for it. I understood the impulse, but it made me lonesome in a specific way that's hard to explain. For the version of the evening where no one knew, where the conversation had been about gutters and plumbing and the cost of copper pipe, and I had been allowed to just be a woman at a table eating turkey with people I didn't know yet. Daniel noticed it too. One evening, a few weeks after the dinner, we were sitting at the kitchen island in my condo, going through the guest list for the wedding. He stopped at his parents' names and held the pen without writing anything. "They're different with you now," he said. "I know. They're trying. I know that too." He put the pen down. "Does it bother you that they're trying for the wrong reason?" I looked at him. "It bothers me that the first reason wasn't good enough." He was quiet for a moment. "I think they're decent people who just measure things by the wrong scale." "Most people do," I said. "That's exactly the problem. It's not specific to them." He nodded slowly. Outside the window, the lights of the city stretched south toward the lake. A streetcar went by on Queen Street. The sound of it, that familiar metal rumble, was the sound of home. I'd lived in this condo for 6 years. Daniel had a key. He kept a toothbrush in the bathroom and hiking boots by the door. This was ours, whatever it was. "Can I ask you something honest?" he said. "Go ahead." He took a breath. "Do you ever wish you'd told me? Earlier, I mean. Before it became a whole thing." I thought about it carefully, because he deserved a careful answer. "I wish I'd told you before your parents found out on a Google search. That part wasn't ideal." I paused. "But I don't regret the time before that. I really don't. I got 2 years of you treating me like someone ordinary. That was a gift." He smiled, a little sadly. "You know, that's a slightly insulting way to compliment someone." "It's the highest compliment I know how to give," I said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I keep thinking about whether I treated you the way they did. Before the dinner, whether I had assumptions about you that I didn't examine." "Did you?" I asked. He thought about it seriously, and I appreciated that. "I think I assumed you were less driven than you are, less consuming. I thought of your job as part of your life. I didn't really understand it was most of your life, at least for long stretches. Is that a problem for you?" "No," he said, "but it means I have some adjusting to do. To be actually useful to you, to understand what I'm actually signing up for." I reached across the island and put my hand over his. "You don't have to be useful to me, you just have to be present." He turned his hand over and held mine. "I think I know the difference now." There was one more conversation that needed to happen, and it happened the following month at a Sunday brunch in Sudbury, just the 4 of us. I had suggested it. Daniel had been surprised by that. His mother had been grateful, and said so twice on the phone when they arranged it. We went to a restaurant in the downtown that his parents liked, the kind of place with wide windows and bottomless coffee and real cloth napkins. His father stood up when I came to the table. His mother hugged me and said it was good to see me, and I believed her. We sat down and ordered. The conversation started carefully, the way conversations do when everyone at the table knows they're navigating something. His father cleared his throat and said, directly, "I owe you a proper apology." "Not through Daniel." I looked at him. "You don't have to." "I want to," he said. "I think we made you feel like a guest who wasn't particularly welcome. That wasn't intentional, but I'm not sure that makes it better." I thought about how to respond. "You treated me the way you thought was appropriate," I said. "And I mean that without sarcasm. You didn't know who I was, so you treated me as someone whose accomplishments weren't known. That's not cruelty. It's just the way people work. We size things up by what we can see." His mother looked uncomfortable. "It's not how I would want to be treated." No, I agreed. But it's how most of us treat others. At least until something intervenes. His father was quiet for a moment. The thing that bothers me, he said finally, is that it took a website for me to ask you a real question. I should have been asking real questions from the start. That was the truest thing anyone in his family had said to me. I told him so. His mother asked, a little later, what it had been like, building the career I had. She asked it with genuine interest, not with the careful performance of impressed politeness I'd seen in the weeks after the dinner. She asked it the way someone asks who is actually curious. I talked about articling at a mid-size firm right out of Osgood, about the years of 70-hour weeks, about the early cases where I made mistakes, and the senior partners who were generous enough to let me learn from them rather than just replacing me. About the first time I sat second chair at a major trial. About the years I billed 2,200 hours in a calendar year, and what that does to a body and a social life. His father leaned forward when I talked about the Supreme Court file. He asked questions. Not impressive questions, honest ones. He got some things wrong about how the court worked and I corrected him gently. He accepted the corrections with equanimity. By the end of brunch, something had loosened. Not completely. It would take longer than one meal, but the shape of the thing had changed. We were 4 people at a table trying to understand each other's actual lives, which is harder than it sounds and rarer than it should be. On the drive home, Daniel reached over and turned down the radio. That was better, he said. Yes, I agreed. My dad actually listened. He did, I said. I was surprised. Daniel smiled. He's stubborn, but he's not closed. There's a difference. I thought about that for the rest of the drive. Stubborn, but not closed. It seemed like a reasonable description of most people I'd met. Stubborn in their categories, their assumed hierarchies, their default sense of who matters and in what order. But not closed, when the door was opened without making them feel foolish for having kept it shut. The wedding was smaller than either of us had initially imagined. A restaurant on King Street, 40 guests, a caterer who made the best roasted root vegetables I'd ever had. His family sat on one side, mine on the other, and by the reception, everyone was thoroughly mixed. His cousin danced with my articling student. His mother and my mother discovered they had both grown up in the same era of the same Canadian country music, which apparently created an immediate and unshakable bond. His father gave a short toast. He talked about his son's steadiness, his patience, the particular quality of attention Daniel brought to people he cared about, and then he paused and said something I had not expected to hear from him. I've learned more from my daughter-in-law in the past year than I've learned from most people I've known for decades, he said. Not because of what she's accomplished. Because of what she made me notice about myself. That's a rare thing. I'm grateful for it. I looked at him across the room and nodded once. He nodded back. Daniel found me a few minutes later and put his arm around my shoulders and said quietly, "He means it." I know, I said. That's why it landed. Looking back, I don't think of any of that year as a test that anyone passed or failed. That's not really how life works, in my experience. People behave according to the categories they've been handed, and then occasionally something intervenes. A website, a conversation, a year of being around someone they didn't expect to know, and the categories shift. Not always permanently, but sometimes enough. What I know is this. The way his parents treated me at that Thanksgiving table, before the phone came out and the search results loaded, that was the most accurate version of how they related to strangers. Not performative, not calculated, just default. And the default was not unkind, but it was excluding in the specific way that invisibility excludes. I was in the room. I just wasn't there. I've spent most of my career in rooms where I was visible and powerful and measured carefully by people assessing what use I might be. Those rooms have their own particular loneliness. But that dinner table was a different loneliness. The loneliness of being present and unmeasured, of existing at no particular value to the people around you. The question, I came to understand, was never which loneliness was worse. The question was whether there existed any space in between. A room where no one was measuring you at all, not upward and not downward. Where you were simply a person among people, eating turkey and arguing about the leaves and passing the gravy, without anyone needing to know who passed it. I think that space is rare. I think it might be the thing worth protecting most carefully. And I think it is, in the end, what Daniel had been trying to offer me from the night on the rooftop with the samosas and the 3-hour conversation about hiking trails. He had just needed time to understand that offering it consciously, deliberately, even when the rest of the world was paying attention, that was the harder and more important thing. The first morning we woke up in the same house as a married couple, a semi-detached in Roncesvalles, which we had spent 6 months slowly making ours. He made coffee, and put a mug on my side of the table without asking how I took it. He already knew. He'd known for 2 years. He sat down across from me and we drank our coffee and read different sections of the same newspaper and didn't need to say anything at all. That was what I had been looking for. That, more than anything, was why I said yes.